there's a certain kind of person who finally has the budget to buy something powerful, something loud, something that turns heads and still walks past it. Most people at that point want proof they've made it. Something bigger, faster, easier to show. But this person chooses something like the Toyota GT86 or the Subaru BRZ, a car that asks more from them than it gives. And then they do something even stranger. They don't just drive it, they learn it. They chase corners instead of straight lines. They care more about how it feels than how it looks. It's not convenient. It's not the obvious choice. And that's exactly the point, because this was never really about having the best car. It's about proving something, quietly, to themselves. And once you understand what that something is, you start to see why they could have chosen anything, and still ended up here. Because for a lot of people, the moment they can afford more, they move toward comfort, toward ease, toward recognition. But this person moves in the opposite direction. And that's where it becomes less about preference and more about psychology. Because choosing something that demands more from you when you don't have to says something very specific about how you see yourself. It suggests that what you're really chasing isn't the outcome, it's the experience of earning it. Now think about how rare that is. Most modern systems are designed to remove effort. Faster cars correct your mistakes. Technology smooths out imperfections. Everything becomes more accessible, more forgiving. But in that process, something subtle disappears. The need to be fully present. And people who are drawn to cars like this, they notice that absence, maybe not consciously, maybe not in words, but they feel it. So instead of choosing something that hides their mistakes, they choose something that reveals them. Because when a car doesn't do the work for you, you're forced to show up differently, more focused, more aware, more precise. And that shift is where the real value begins. But there's something deeper underneath that. Because it's not just about control of the car. It's about control of the self. When you're navigating a tight corner, balancing grip, adjusting inputs in real time, there's no space for distraction, no space for overthinking, no space for noise. You're either present or you're not. And in a world that constantly pulls your attention in 100 directions, that kind of clarity becomes addictive. This is where it starts to evolve. Because over time, it's no longer just about driving well. It's about becoming the kind of person who can drive well. Someone who stays calm under pressure. Someone who reads situations instead of reacting blindly. Someone who improves, not instantly, but gradually, deliberately. And that identity doesn't stay inside the car. It follows you. Now consider this. A lot of these owners don't leave their car stuck for long. Not because they're trying to impress people, but because they're trying to refine something. Small adjustments. Suspension dialed in. Tires chosen carefully. Subtle changes that most people wouldn't even notice. And that's important. Because when you're still figuring out who you are, you gravitate toward things you can shape. Things that reflect your decisions back at you. And a car like this becomes a kind of canvas. Not for attention, but for alignment. You change it, test it, adjust it again. And in a quiet way, you're learning how to do the same with your own life. Because the process is similar. You don't get it perfect immediately. You make mistakes. You overcorrect. You learn. And slowly, things start to feel right. But there's another layer most people overlook. Because from the outside, this choice doesn't always make sense. It's not the fastest option. It's not the most luxurious. It doesn't dominate conversations the way more expensive cars do. So why choose it? Why commit to something that requires more effort without offering obvious rewards? This is where it becomes less about cars and more about values. Because choosing something like this is a quiet statement. It says, I don't need the easiest path. I don't need constant validation. I care more about how something feels than how it's perceived. And that mindset is rare. Because most people are conditioned to optimize, to compare, to justify, to follow what makes the most sense on paper. But this person isn't optimizing for paper. They're optimizing for experience. And that difference changes everything. You'll notice it in small behaviors. They take routes others avoid. They enjoy the process, even when it's slower. They pay attention to details most people ignore. And over time, that perspective starts to expand. Because once you start valuing engagement over convenience in one area, you begin to question everything else. Why rush through moments that could be experienced Why always choose comfort over growth? Why define success by how things look instead of how they feel? And slowly, your decisions start to shift, not dramatically, but consistently. But there's something even more subtle beneath all of this. Because for some people, this isn't just about moving forward. It's about holding on to something, a version of themselves that existed before everything became optimized. Before choices were filtered through practicality, efficiency, approval. A time when doing something simply because it felt right was enough. And driving like this brings that back. Not completely, but just enough to remind you that it's still there. And that reminder matters more than it seems. Because as life becomes more structured, more demanding, it's easy to lose that connection. So you create spaces where it can still exist. Moments where you're not performing, not proving, not calculating, just experiencing. And that's what these drives become. Not escapes, but returns. Returns to a state where you're fully there, fully involved, fully aware. And over time, that feeling starts to bleed into other parts of life. You begin to notice when you're disconnected. When you're going through routines without actually being present. When you're choosing convenience at the cost of meaning. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee it. So in a way, a decision that looked small from the outside becomes something much bigger on the inside, not because of the car itself, but because of what it trains you to notice, what it forces you to become. And maybe that's the part most people miss. It was never about choosing a slower car or a harder path. It was about choosing a different relationship with experience. One where you don't just move through life, but actually feel it. And maybe the real question isn't why some people end up here, but what they've understood that others are still trying to avoid.